Well, welcome everyone to this recorded session on forest stewardship for a changing world. My name is Aleta McKeague. I'm the technical director of the Waldo County Soil and Water Conservation District. Sorry I can't be with you in person today, but I'm happy to respond to each of your questions and comments related to this talk, so feel free to email me after listening. Most of you are in this course because you're interested in stewarding your land or working with your forest. Many of us own working forests, woodlands that we manage for recreation or wildlife, agricultural lands, and mixed-use properties. All of you that are participating in this class want to steward land so that it remains healthy and resilient, and you love the Maine woods and want to do what you can to keep it healthy for the future. This presentation is about some of the changes that are affecting woodlands that we need to think about right now, such as climate change, but also other change agents that we need to think about. One point I'd like to make today, and this is a viewpoint shared by many in the world of land management and conservation, is that climate change is a serious problem, but it is in fact one aspect of a larger problem, and that is the breakdown in living systems that we have now that's due to many factors in addition to climate change. So I'd like to introduce a few ideas that are important to think about as we consider what we're going to do to manage woodlands in the near future and over the course of the next century. As you know, the things we do now will be vital to how our woodlands look decades from now. We need to go beyond thinking about natural regeneration and consider the more deliberate, intensive act of planting trees. As you know, we plant trees not for ourselves, but for future generations. And it is vital that we begin to work now so that we don't end up with a greatly reduced canopy cover as current tree species decline. So we do have significant climate change that has already happened and is continuing to occur and is accelerating. As we know, it causes geophysical changes, but it also causes changes in living systems. Human systems are affected by climate change, but also by loss of biodiversity and functional ecosystems. So when I talk about living systems, I'm referring to ecosystems and their many components, including their diverse range of species, but also human systems that interact with those living systems, such as agriculture, our economic systems, forestry, and communities. The spread of invasive species is also a significant threat to our living systems, and perhaps as important as climate change in terms of the loss of biodiversity. Other major changes are occurring because of human use of resources and land. Habitat is being fragmented, and there are also pollutants and pesticides being released into the environment that stress different species. So if you think about all of these factors together, what we really have is a crisis in living systems. We have the breakdown of living systems, and climate change is just one aspect of that. Now in the Northeast, forest ecosystems in the Northwoods are our primary living system. They're being highly impacted by all of the factors I mentioned. So what's going to happen as a result of this? Scientists are working very hard to create models for predicting what's going to happen in those living systems. And one of the ideas I'd like to emphasize today is that scientific modeling that's going on right now can be used by all of us as landowners to begin to manage our woodlands now and in the future. Our forests are going to be in a novel state that we haven't seen before, and without some effort and some attempt to predict the future and react to possible changes, we are going to face significant loss of species and also structural diversity, and thus the health and resilience of our forest systems. So we need to think about the fact that our traditional forest management will need to be adapted and will likely require forestry practices that are quite different than we've used in the past. Moving beyond natural regeneration and harvest choices to potentially deliberate introduction of new tree species and perhaps other organisms onto the landscape. It's useful to think about several phases that ecosystems can be in as we talk about this. So ecosystems since glacial times have been moving through a natural state with some human interaction, but essentially having the group of species that they've had for thousands of years. And we call that a historic ecosystem, or sometimes a reference ecosystem. In much of the Maine woods, however, the forest is in a novel state now due to human use, disease, and the introduction of invasive species. If an ecosystem is a combination of its historic system with traditional species present and also has changes that have occurred due to human use and other factors, then it would be called a hybrid ecosystem. If it's entirely changed from its original composition, it could be called a novel ecosystem. So if we think about the living systems that comprise the Maine woods, including its human occupants, we can think about four major pressures that are causing change: climate change, development, loss of space, invasive species, and pollutants are all acting on our ecosystem today. They're causing reduced biodiversity in the ecosystem. And as we know, a rich variety of species performing many functions in the ecosystem, including some redundant functions, is a very important part of that system being resilient. Now, I'd like to think for a moment about climate change, because a lot of the modeling that we're going to look at related to the Maine forest are based on a number of trends in climate change, and also how those changes in the climate are specifically affecting tree species. So we think of climate change, we tend to think more about the non-living, the geophysical factors that are involved. We know that we have sea level rise, which has already occurred. In our area of the Gulf of Maine, the seas are as much as a foot higher than they were 100 years ago. We have extreme storm events, and we've had a very steady increase in the mean annual temperature over the last 120 years or so that we've kept records. So it's gone up pretty much inexorably since then. And most of that change has been since 1970. Over the last century, we've had a 2-degree Fahrenheit rise in our mean annual temperature. Now, in other words, basically that change is accelerating as we go. It's very important to think about that in terms of how trees grow, but one thing we have to remember is that precipitation and temperature are not changing evenly over all the seasons of the year, and that's very critical to think about in terms of tree and plant growth. So, precipitation is another thing that actually has increased over the last century, pretty much at a regular rate of around a ½ inch increase per decade. Now, the thing to remember there is that is not occurring in the summer so much as it is occurring in transitional seasons such as winter, spring, and fall. And so, as you know, we've had drought over the last several years during the summer months, while having increased precipitation in the other seasons. So those are all dynamics of climate change that I think are important to understand. There's a lot of information out there, but there's just some of these really basic changes that are going to impact our forest ecosystems and our trees. So if we want to steward our woodlands in the coming decades, we'll need to work with the change that is occurring. To do this effectively, we need to think about what will happen in the next few decades, and also in terms of what will happen over the course of the next century, with multiple plausible futures and different scenarios for emissions and human activity, as well as putting in different models of, say, global climate circulation and other factors, such as the characteristics of species and what their limitations are in terms of temperature and moisture. So all of those things can be fed in together into models that have been created. So I'm going to talk today a little bit more about some models that have been adapted and made so that landowners and the general public can look at them and begin to predict or think about what might happen here in the future. So we can take this information and we can shape our own exploratory practices in woodland management. We can learn from what we're doing, and together with other landowners, managers, and scientists, create some tentative ideas about shaping and restoring our forests with changes that are happening. So before I talk about things that we can do to steward our forest in the face of tremendous change, I want to talk a little bit about changes in living systems and the loss in biodiversity that we know we have now from the data that's available. In recent years, scientists have compiled data from a vast group of different studies that have happened over time, even such things as the Audubon Christmas bird count and citizen science efforts. And put those together in sort of summaries of what's been happening over recent decades. There was an article in the journal Science recently that amalgamated a lot of these different studies about birds and found that we have had a loss of nearly 3 billion birds from the North American continent since 1970. So this is really a shocking loss of biodiversity and a breakdown in our living systems. Another area where studies have been compiled and looked at for change over time is the presence of insect species and the total volume of insects that are out there. And one thing that has been discovered in recent studies comparing the past to the present is that over the last few decades, we have lost 50 to 80% of our total insect and invertebrate biomass. Now, this is a shocking situation that seems to be present in studies that have been done all over the world, including in the Northeast. As you know, insects form the base of our living systems and ecosystems and are extraordinarily important as food for birds and wildlife and to pollinate plants. Insects and other invertebrates are also critical to the health of our soils. Now, a lot of our trees are wind pollinated, but 80% of plants overall require insects for pollination. So that definitely is going to be an impact on our forest ecosystems. 35% of our crop species also rely on insects. This decline in biodiversity and biomass is taking our living systems to the point where they will be unstable and have a vastly reduced diversity of species. So if you look at other groups of living things, you can see this problem is occurring across the board. Many groups of species are down by a significant percentage. And you can see here some of the studies that have been done and amalgamations of studies, losses we have in different groups, including amphibians, butterflies, native species in general. The biomass is down 20%, which is shocking. And, you know, it makes me personally want to take action to do whatever I can on my land to support native species. One reason I like to show this slide is if you take a look at the bar graph on the right there, it's interesting to see that if you look at the very top bar that goes to the right of the center line, that means essentially that there have not been species declining in wetland habitats. And you can see there are some other North American habitat areas. So why is that? Well, we put tremendous effort into adaptive management and restoration and protection of wetlands. And as a result, we have seen species biodiversity sustained and even increased. In other words, what we do on the landscape, especially across large scales, is going to have a potentially tremendous impact on preserving our resilient living systems. That is going to mean that each one of us must work to restore habitat on our own property. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the forest ecosystem in the Northeast and in Maine, which many of you own a portion of. As you know, plants as well as insects are the basis for our living system in the North Woods. They are also a key to restoring biodiversity, and they're critical to limiting climate change as well. So that makes our work in the forest very important. I'd like for all of you now to think for a moment about the tree species that make up the Maine woods and a little bit about the many changes that have impacted those species over the last century or so. Now, if you look back to the early 20th century, you know that our woods was vastly altered when the chestnuts died out from disease. This caused a tremendous loss of food for wildlife as well as forest cover at the time. Soon thereafter, the American elm was decimated by disease, not only in towns and cities, but in our bottomlands. In the current era, we're losing ash and hemlock trees, as well as beech trees, to disease processes and invasive insects. Many of our northern and boreal species, such as birch and aspen, as well as spruce and fir, are predicted to decline because of climate change. So think about the fact that all of these trees are major trees that have formed the Maine woods up till now, okay? So basically, as we look at models, what's going to happen due to climate change and also disease, you can see that I've mentioned many of the major trees that live in the Maine woods that are predicted to decline very significantly. And you know, we're likely to have some species that will continue to be here and thrive, that are modeled to be adaptive to changes and do well in the future, such as red oak, red maple, and even white pines may be able to withstand some pressures. But we don't know what diseases or invasive insects will affect these trees in the future. What we end up with, regardless, with the current problems that we have, is the potential for many of our major canopy species to die out and our forests to be left to be overgrown with what? Perhaps invasive shrubs and plants. So all of the trees that I've mentioned are critical to native insect species as well as for wildlife food. It's basically a very dire picture, which begins to look like we're going to lose the Maine woods as we know it. I painted a grim picture here, and for trees and other species in our ecosystem. And it seems like it'd be easy to be pessimistic as we look at how we're going to care for our forest. But my talk isn't actually about gloom and doom scenarios, though, because I believe that whatever is happening, that we as conscientious stewards and restorationists can take steps to heal our planet and make sure that the forest and its ecosystems, its birds, its wildlife, its insects, and other creatures can go on existing here. Now, so the rest of my talk is essentially about what we can do to carefully and deliberately manage forests in potentially new ways for the future. A first step is that we can think about tree species and their role in the environment, and to think about some species that have potential to grow in the Maine woods that may not be here now. It's helpful to think about roles that different groups of trees have in the ecosystem as a starting point. Now here you see 4 groups of trees that right now have common species in the Maine woods: oaks, willows, cherries, and birches. The number that you see next to each group is the number of insect species that are specifically dependent on that type of tree. And in fact, these groups of species are the trees that support the most native insects. So thinking about different types of trees that support native insects is a very important starting point in creating, potentially adapting our forest for the future so that it can support native species. So the basic process here is that these trees support the larvae of a host of native insects, and those insects in turn form the primary food for most birds to feed their young. Even birds that eat seeds and other things as adult feed their young insect larvae. So I've talked about tree species and their role in a healthy, resilient ecosystem, and I've talked about specific groups of trees that are very important in the ecosystem. I'd also like to mention another aspect of having a healthy forest canopy and tree species, and that is that trees have an extremely important role in mitigating climate change. Mature trees remove thousands of pounds of carbon dioxide per year from the atmosphere and fix it in their tissues, including the leaves, which in turn fall to earth, and the carbon is then sequestered in the soil system. And of course, carbon in a mature tree is sequestered for many decades and even centuries. So, what's exciting now is that we're beginning to quantify and create economic value from this important economics service, ecosystem service of these trees. And now forest carbon credits offer another potential pathway for woodland owners to obtain economic value from their forest, perhaps combining planting and maintaining intact forest in concert with harvest as a source of income. I want to return to this slide that shows some of the different important groups of trees that we have had in the Maine forest that we're likely to lose. Think also of the tree species I mentioned that are very important for insects. I want you to think about these groups of trees, but maybe step outside of thinking of the specific species that are currently living in the Maine woods and on your property. So think of what we're losing and think of other tree species that might provide some of those critical services and roles in the ecosystem. Now, I'd like to ask you to go ahead and open up the resource links that were provided to you for this course session. And I'd like to ask that you open up the climate change tree atlas link that I've sent. It's a little bit challenging to show you how this works live on an internet browser as I'm doing the Zoom presentation. But I'd like to ask you that as you're watching to go ahead and pause the presentation either now or after I've talked about this a little bit and try the climate change tree atlas tool. What this is an example of how scientists have taken a number of models of climate change, as well as how trees grow in our forest across the eastern United States, and combined them into a useful tool that's meant for landowners and the public to take a look at how changes might occur. This in turn can inform you as far as some practices and planting you might want to do on your own land. The reason I'm interested in showing you this tool is that I'd like to have you take a look at some of the species that you'll see on another handout I've given you as a link here. And what you'll do is you can put some of those trees through this climate change tree atlas tool and look at changes that could happen under various scenarios of extreme climate change or moderated climate change, and reduced emission or continued emission of carbon into the atmosphere. Now, when you go into the climate change tree atlas, you'll see this page, and there's also an atlas for birds. You'll see at the top there, but on the right there, you can search for a tree species. Okay. So you could type in a tree there, okay, such as eastern hemlock, which I've typed in. And what you'll see, what comes up immediately is a map of where that tree is present now in the eastern forest. On a simple level, the way the map works is that the darker color from blue to green to yellow, lighter colors, indicates the level of dominance in the eastern forest in that region. So blue being where it's a very significant presence in the composition of the forest, green somewhat, lighter green less so, and then of course the yellow area is an area where that tree is not really present in current conditions. So what you can do then, let's see, let's take a look here. What you can do then is in the box where it says show me at the top, you can change the combinations of models or the averaging of models for harsher and reduced levels of climate change. We don't really know exactly how the climate is going to change. What we have done is use models to predict how it might change. And again, the level of emissions that humans put into the atmosphere is very significant in terms of what happens. So you can basically make changes in the models you want to show, and the box on the right there where it says under, you can change the level of emissions that might occur. And if you'd like to know more about how this works and what these models are, I really suggest that you take a look at the link to the book that I've sent you, which explains more about how this model works. But you could see here, you know, if we look back at under current conditions, that we have hemlock presence in Maine. It's very significant in south central areas of the state. And under climate change, let's go this direction, under a fairly high level of change, high emissions, and harsher scenarios of global circulation models averaged there on the left under the show me box, you can see that the potential composition for hemlock is vastly different under these scenarios. Now, what's interesting here is the models used in the tree atlas are not all of the models of change. And for example, this one is not accounting for possible decline of hemlock due to hemlock woolly adelgid. However, there's other models that feed in all the different stressors on trees, reproductive rates, potential regeneration, and distribution of the tree to give you other scenarios. This particular tool is showing you, based on climate and climate change and the tree's basic habitat characteristics, where this tree could live in the future. So the other handout I gave you that I think is really, really interesting, and it's meant for the average person to look at a summary of a lot of the research and models that have been going on tree species in coastal Maine. It's a one-page handout. One side looks like this, and the other side has a chart with a lot of different tree species on it. So the chart is very useful in getting a quick sense of which trees might thrive here in the future. Not all the trees listed currently live throughout Maine, of course. If you look at this chart with this list of species, you'll see simple symbols to the right of each species indicating the tree's potential for increased habitat or decreased habitat. And it also has indicators there for the species' ability to cope and persist as the climate changes based on that tree's particular characteristics, including adaptability and reproduction. So you can see a plus, a dot, or a minus there for adaptability. And then to the right, you see triangles pointing upward and in green for potential increase, and downward and in red for potential decrease. And then there's several columns there. The first couple of columns with triangles are for limited climate change scenarios. Again, we don't know exactly what's going to happen. And on the right there's two columns with scenarios for higher levels of climate change and global warming. So I want to take a closer look at that summary of the different models for tree species in a minute. For now, I'd like to talk about a few possibilities, new ideas for things that we can do to steward our forests for the future. It's important to remember that the things we do on our own land can have an extraordinary impact on forest health, its diversity, its resilience in the face of stressors and change. One potential solution is to move beyond just thinking about natural regeneration and to potentially begin to plant new tree species in new areas in Maine. Now, this is an idea that has previously been controversial, But across the North Woods from Minnesota to Maine, many professionals are beginning a process of studying this question and even taking action to move tree species. For example, the Minnesota Department of Forestry is already using seed sources from more southerly populations to do reforestation in the northern parts of the state. So the question being asked and studied at this time is, do we potentially plant adaptive species that are not currently native? One way to look at this question is, to what degree will we plant new species in new areas? One idea that's being explored, as I mentioned, across the northern parts of the eastern forest is, will we in fact help trees to migrate northward as the climate warms, which is known as assisted migration? Now, there's several levels of this that can be considered, and all of these things are being studied and experimented with in plantings right now. One is to, less radical, is to move populations or local genotypes of native trees within their range to points further north, which is known as assisted population migration. Another possibility is to expand the range of species into nearby areas that are near where they currently live through planting, and that's called assisted range expansion. And the most radical possibility is to move trees to areas completely outside of its current native range, sometimes to areas far north of where it currently grows. And let's take a look again at this chart summarizing models about how well different eastern trees might do in the future. You notice I've circled a tree at the bottom right of this chart, the yellow poplar, also known as the tulip tree or tulip poplar. You can see from the upward pointing triangles and the plus sign for adaptation is that this tree is modeled to potentially do well in the coastal Maine climate. So let's think about this species for a moment. And I'm kind of taking you through the process that we use to select trees for study for assisted migration. So here you can see the current range of the tulip poplar, okay? And you can see that it extends into southern New England, but also you can see that it is growing in more northerly points in Vermont. Okay, so that's an important part of our analysis about this tree. That gives us an indication it might potentially survive in colder areas or in the current climate, which still has very cold periods in the winter months. So we also want to think about where this tree is now in general. And of course, if you think about bringing the tulip poplar to Maine, that is a leap outside of its current range. So that would be considered assisted migration. We also want to think about the traits of these species as we consider potentially planting them here to adapt our forests for the future. The tulip tree or tulip poplar is a tree that supports pollinator insects with its large flowers. It produces copious seeds, which we also call soft mast, which might potentially replace seeds lost from the decline of elm and ash trees. So in other words, it might fill a role in the ecosystem where we might end up with a gap. It's also an attractive tree that can be planted in residential areas, and it has the potential to grow fast, be tall and straight, and produce lumber. So those are all traits that make it a tree of interest to us right now, as well as the adaptability it's been modeled to have. Now let's look at another species, okay? And you can see I've circled it here on that chart. And it has some indications of potential adaptability for the future. Not as much as the tulip poplar, but you can see that under different, less and more scenarios of climate change, this tree is modeled to perhaps do well and increase the areas where it can live. Okay, so why am I interested in shagbark hickory? Well, for one thing, as you can see here in its current range, it does live in Maine, and it gets up nearly to the mid-coast area of Maine. So if we were to plant shagbark hickory, say in the Belfast area, it would essentially be an act of looking at, can we expand the range of this tree? So it's not such a leap as full assisted migration northward out of its native range. The other thing I see here is that the shagbark hickory, in fact, is growing in areas far to the north of coastal Maine and as far north as much of the state of Maine. So that indicates to me, especially looking at genotypes from that area, that this is a tree that might be able to grow here right now. Okay, let's take a look at the next slide. So as we look at shagbark hickory, we also want to look at those other traits of this tree and characteristics that have important potential. The tree has potential to provide copious nuts that can provide nutritious, tasty food for wildlife and for people. As we have lost our chestnut and beech crops, this could be potentially a very important function that it might fulfill in the ecosystem. Interestingly, shagbark hickory has bark that peels in a manner that can provide habitat for some native bat species, which are also in serious decline. Yet another factor is its beautiful, economically valuable wood. All of these things are emblematic of what makes a potentially adaptive tree species something we might want to consider for planting in our area. Another species that's really not much of a stretch to think about starting to plant in central and coastal parts of Maine is the white oak. It reaches into, I want to talk about it a little more for a second. It does reach right into the Maine, as does the shagbark hickory. And as I mentioned previously, oaks, and especially white oaks, are extremely important to native insect life. It's a very adaptable tree. It's modeled to be adaptable to potential conditions here in the future. And it's also a beautiful tree that provides food for wildlife and high quality lumber. So, you know, that's the type of tree that we want to plant now and start growing. And we want here in the coming decades, and we certainly want to look at that when that tree can start thriving in other areas of Maine. So besides the white oak, there's a lot of species of oak trees that grow just to the south and west of Maine. Many parts of Maine, the red oak is our only native species of oak. But some of these other oaks have modeled to be adaptable and have many characteristics that would fulfill function in our ecosystems and provide forest products. Chestnut oak is another interesting tree that we're studying right now in this area. The black gum or Tupelo tree is another tree that I always want to mention when I'm talking about adaptable trees that we might want to start growing and planting. It does grow up into southern and coastal Maine, so that's an indication that the tree can grow here. Another thing about this tree is that some of these trees are very ornamental, and they've been planted for a considerable period of time. And these older specimens that are doing fine here now really can also be data and indicators of these trees having potential to grow in our area. The black gum has very nutritious, copious fruit available to migrating birds in the fall. Again, very important in terms of supporting biodiversity. It's a beautiful tree with good fall color. It can be grown in human landscapes, cities, parks, and yards, and it also can be grown in forests. So as we think about the modeling for species that might decline in the future, pretty much across the board, the models show that as the climate warms, we're going to lose some of our very northern and boreally adapted species, such as paper birch, spruce, and fir. And as you recall, I mentioned that birch trees are extremely important for native insects, and they're also very important to birds for food. So as we lose boreal species such as paper birch, why not look at planting similar species in those important groups of trees that might thrive here in the future and are in fact modeled to grow well here, such as the black birch, sweet birch, or perhaps the river birch. Another thing that we should be looking at now through our planting efforts on our land is, do we want to restore some of these very important trees that have lived here as part of the historic ecosystem, such as the elm trees and the chestnut trees? As many of you know, there has been a lot of work and a lot of people putting effort into trying to hybridize or otherwise adapt these trees so that they can be planted and grown here again. So planting hybridized chestnut and elms trees right now is probably a very good thing to do. We're getting those trees back onto the landscape and they can begin to fulfill their important functions in providing wildlife food, as well as beauty and lumber. Other trees we might want to consider planting are trees that fulfill roles in the ecosystem, can function in habitats we have that have less of the original trees present, or that can adapt to potential climate change results such as increased fire or decreased precipitation in the summertime. So the American sycamore is a tree that can grow. It's a very large, beautiful tree that can grow in floodplain forest and bottomlands where we've lost elm trees. And it's also a tree that does grow in Maine, and we do have larger specimens of it that have been planted here, so it's likely to do well. The chestnut oak is a tree that's modeled to be very adaptive, and it can withstand wildfire pressures and drought in the summertime. We want to look at the tree's economic value. Can they produce lumber, other forest products? So planting trees such as black walnut or different hickory species may occur because of these trees' potential to help the forest products industry. Now, it's important to remember that the forest isn't just made up of these canopy trees, but it has many layers to it. It has sub-canopy trees, small trees, shrubs, and ground level vegetation. This vertical structure is also very important to the living system and to support biodiversity in the forest. So on that note, it's important to also think about plants and trees that we might plant that could potentially form understory layers in the future forest. And I think this is interesting to do on our planted landscapes right now, because a lot of these trees are beautiful. They support pollinators, wildlife, they produce edible fruits. So several trees I want to mention on that account that we are interested in having people plant now to see how they do here are the redbud tree, the pawpaw tree, spice bush, and other trees that can potentially grow and naturalize into the forest ecosystem. So thinking about the modeling I've showed you and some of the ways that we consider how these trees might function here in the future can inform the things that you do right now on your land. So as you consider your forestry plan, you can think about retaining species that are modeled to be able to thrive here in the coming decades, such as red oak, white pine, basswood, black cherry, red maple, sugar maple, retain healthy beech and ash trees that might be showing resistance to disease, and aspen. Some aspens are modeled to do well in current thinking, and they support wildlife, and important adaptable understory plants such as ironwood. In order to learn how we might adapt to significant change, it may be a good idea to begin now to plant and observe some of the potentially adaptive trees that don't grow in our area right now, but might be a part of our future forest. Such as some of the trees I've mentioned here, tulip tree, shagbark hickory, black walnut, white oak, chestnut oak, sweet birch, sycamore, black gum, and others. You can look at that chart that I gave to you to get some ideas about what might go on the landscape now. And again, we're doing experimental practices to learn things at this point. And thinking about understory trees and other species that don't they don't live in the forest right now, or they're from points further south, but it certainly would be interesting to plant trees that have potential to restore the forest or have a place in the vertical structure or provide economic benefit. So this is some of the trees I've listed here. Of course, there are important questions that we have to ask about whether these trees will naturalize and whether they will become invasive or otherwise cause imbalance in ecosystems. Will they grow too vigorously? And the only way we can know this and as well as begin to get ready to fill gaps that we're likely to have in our forest is to plant these trees now and look at what they do and learn about them. And some of them potentially will start to naturalize and be a great thing to have here in the coming decades. Some of them we may choose to propagate and plant widely. So on that note, research is already taking place on the coast of Maine. Here you can see a project for planting research plots in Belfast, Maine, where the Waldo County Soil and Water Conservation District is partnering with the Schoodic Institute to study potentially adaptive trees for assisted migration right now. And on the right there, you can see a chestnut oak in one of our study plots. That tree is 5 feet tall and it's been growing there for just a couple of years. And you can see that we've done some studies to exclude and allow deer browse and other browse on these trees, and that they are growing in a competitive environment in the forest understory. So what the study like this is really answering right now is questions about whether these trees as seedlings and saplings can thrive in the current climate and whether they can stand up to competition and browsing. So a lot of interesting questions being asked and answered with the data that we're collecting over the next 5 years. But really, this is a formal research study by scientists. Landowners, all of us, all of you listening today can begin to contribute to this knowledge and this research about what we're going to need to do to adapt our forests for the future. And you can plant trees now that might have an important role to play as they mature over the course of the rest of this century. Our Soil and Water Conservation District has a citizen science program called Report a Tree, where you can plant trees of many of the species I've mentioned today and report to us how they're doing. And it also has options to report whether you find a beech tree that you think might be resistant to beech bark disease, or a healthy mature elm trees. So it collects all kinds of data about how trees are growing right now. So I'd encourage any of you that are interested in this to begin planting experimental trees and share your information with us about how those trees are doing. So all of this is important because our future is going to come from the new knowledge that we create right now as we plant adaptively and we nurture our novel and our hybrid ecosystem into something that is healthy and resilient and is a functional living system. It's not just going to be the work of scientists, but also you as landowners, land managers, foresters, and others that will create the knowledge and methods we need to keep our forests growing and healthy in the future. So I'd like to thank you for listening to this class presentation. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions regarding the session today, and I'd be happy to discuss this further with any of you that are participating. Thank you so much.